Blood is thicker than water, but money? Money is thicker than blood. I spent 2 years wiping our dying father's brow while my sister drank champagne in Milan. When he died, she didn't just want her share, she wanted it all. I thought I was going to lose everything, until the courtroom doors violently swung open. If you had asked anyone in Chicago's North Shore high society who Arthur Harrington's favorite daughter was, they would have laughed at the question. It was Beatrice. It had always been Beatrice. My sister was a force of nature. 5 years older than me, she inherited my father's sharp blue eyes, his ruthless charisma, and his insatiable appetite for the finer things in life. She was the captain of the cheerleading squad, the valedictorian who barely studied, and eventually, the wife of a ridiculously wealthy British hedge fund manager. She moved to London, then Milan, living a life of yachts, galas, and designer clothes. I was the ghost. Chloe Harrington, the quiet one who preferred books to ball gowns, the one who stayed behind in Chicago to work at an underfunded youth shelter in the city. My father, a self-made real estate tycoon who had clawed his way up from nothing, didn't understand me. He loved me, I think, but I was a puzzle he didn't have the patience to solve. Beatrice was his mirror. I was just his shadow. But everything changed when the doctors uttered 3 letters. ALS. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis is a cruel, unforgiving thief. It didn't care about my father's bank account, his golf handicap, or his real estate empire. It started with a slight tremor in his right hand. Within a year, he was confined to a wheelchair, his booming voice reduced to a raspy whisper. When the diagnosis came down, I called Beatrice. I remember sitting in the sterile hallway of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, my hands shaking as I held the phone to my ear. Bea, it's bad, I told her, fighting back tears. He's going to need round-the-clock care. You need to come home. I can still hear the clinking of glassware in the background of her call. Oh, Chloe, don't be so dramatic, she sighed, her tone dripping with bored condescension. I'm in the middle of a charity gala in Lake Como. Hire the best nurses. Spare no expense. That's what his money is for. I'll fly out for Christmas. She didn't fly out for Christmas. Or the next one. For 2 agonizing, beautiful, heartbreaking years, I moved back into my childhood home. I quit my job. I became my father's primary caregiver, coordinating with the rotating staff of palliative nurses. I fed him when his hands stopped working. I read to him when his eyes failed him. In those quiet hours, the tycoon faded away, and for the first time in my life, I truly got to know my father. He confessed his regrets, his fears, and, most surprisingly, his deep disappointment in the empire he had built and the golden child he had spoiled. I built a kingdom, Chloe, he whispered to me one rainy Tuesday, his breathing labored. But I filled it with the wrong people. Except you. You stayed. Arthur Harrington took his final breath on a cold morning in February. The moment the obituary hit the papers, the grieving daughter made her grand entrance. Beatrice arrived in Chicago, swathed in black Tom Ford, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. She took over the funeral arrangements, ensuring it was a high society spectacle, shaking hands with politicians and business magnates while I stood in the back, exhausted and hollowed out. 3 days after the funeral, we sat in the mahogany-paneled office of my father's longtime estate attorney, Jonathan Weaver. Beatrice was already scrolling through real estate listings on her phone, mentally spending the fortune. The estate was valued at roughly $42 million, not including the commercial properties downtown. Jonathan cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. Arthur made several amendments to his will in the final 6 months of his life, he began, his voice steady but cautious. Beatrice didn't even look up. Yes, skip the legalese, Jonathan. Just tell us the split. And please tell me he left that awful lake house to charity. To my eldest daughter, Beatrice Harrington Smythe, Jonathan read, I leave the sum of $250,000 to be paid in a single lump sum. I also leave her my profound hope that she learns the value of presence over presence. The silence in the room was absolute. Beatrice froze, her manicured finger hovering over her screen. And to my youngest daughter, Chloe Harrington, Jonathan continued, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all liquid assets, investment portfolios, and real estate holdings. Chloe, you were the light in my darkest hours. Use this to do the good you've always wanted to do. Beatrice slowly lowered her phone. The mask of the grieving, sophisticated socialite shattered, replaced by a contorted mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "This is a joke," she hissed, slamming her hands on the mahogany desk. He was out of his mind. He was heavily medicated, dying, and weak. She turned her venomous gaze to me. "What did you do, Chloe? What papers did you force him to sign while you had him locked away in that house?" "I didn't force him to do anything, Bae," I said quietly, my heart pounding against my ribs. "He made his own choices." "Oh, you manipulative little bitch," she spat, stepping toward me before Jonathan intervened. "You played the martyr. You isolated him. You poisoned him against me. You think you're going to steal my inheritance? I will tie you up in court until you are begging for pennies on the street. I will destroy you." She stormed out of the office, the heavy oak door slamming behind her with a sound like a gunshot. The war had begun. Beatrice was as good as her word. Within 2 weeks, I was served with a massive lawsuit. She was contesting the will on the grounds of undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. She claimed I had systematically isolated our father, intercepted his mail, blocked his phone calls, and brainwashed a dying, mentally compromised man into disinheriting her. To lead her crusade, Beatrice hired Richard Sterling. Richard Sterling wasn't just a lawyer, he was a legal assassin. He was a shark in a $3,000 suit, famous in Chicago for breaking witnesses on the stand and walking away with multi-million-dollar settlements. Against him, I had David Arquette, an honest but hopelessly overworked probate lawyer who looked like he hadn't slept a full 8 hours since the late 90s. The trial took place at the Richard J. Daley Center, in the courtroom of the Honorable Judge Theodore Wallace. Judge Wallace was a legend in Cook County, a stern, traditionalist judge with a reputation for having zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics. He was in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and eyes that seemed to look right through you. Word around the courthouse was that Wallace favored family harmony and looked very unfavorably upon children who alienated their parents from other siblings. From the first day, Sterling went on the offensive. He didn't just want to win the money, he wanted to annihilate my character. He painted a picture of me that was so monstrous, so deeply deceptive, that there were moments I almost didn't recognize myself. According to Sterling, I wasn't a loving daughter who gave up her life to care for her dying father. I was a calculating parasite. The worst part wasn't the accusations. It was the people Beatrice had bought to support them. Sterling called Nurse Clara Jenkins to the stand. Clara had been one of my father's night nurses for about a month before I had to fire her for sleeping on the job. "Nurse Jenkins," Sterling purred, pacing in front of the jury box. "Can you describe the environment in the Harrington home during the time you cared for Arthur?" Clara looked at me, a brief flash of guilt in her eyes before she hardened her jaw. "It was very controlled. Oppressive, even. Miss Chloe was always hovering. She wouldn't let Arthur use his iPad. I once heard him asking to call his eldest daughter, Beatrice, and Chloe told him the phone was broken." "Objection!" David yelled, half standing. "Hearsay! Overruled," Judge Wallace barked, glaring down at David. "I'll allow it. Proceed." "So, in your professional opinion, Nurse Jenkins, was Arthur Harrington making his own decisions in those final months?" "No, sir," Clara lied smoothly. "Chloe was pulling all the strings. It went on like this for 3 agonizing days. Distant cousins I hadn't seen in a decade testified that I had a jealous streak regarding Beatrice. A hired medical expert who had never even met my father took the stand to testify that the pain medication my father was on would have made him highly susceptible to suggestion. I sat at the defense table, feeling the walls closing in. The jury was looking at me not with sympathy, but with suspicion. Even Judge Wallace seemed to be glaring at me with thinly veiled contempt. In the gallery behind her lawyer, Beatrice sat in immaculate designer clothes, shooting me triumphant, icy smirks. She was winning. She was going to take everything, and she was going to leave me with a ruined reputation. Then came my turn to take the stand. David asked me gentle questions, trying to establish the reality of my father's care. But when Richard Sterling stood up for cross-examination, he didn't ask questions. He threw grenades. "Miss Harrington," Sterling sneered, leaning heavily on the podium, "you claim you quit your job out of the goodness of your heart, but isn't it true you were barely making $40,000 a year at that shelter?" "I loved my job," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm sure you did. But 40,000 is a long cry from 40 million, isn't it? He didn't wait for an answer. You saw an opportunity. Your wealthy father was weak, vulnerable. Your glamorous sister was an ocean away. So you swooped in. You became the gatekeeper. You isolated him until he had no one left but you. That's not true, I cried, tears finally spilling over. I begged Beatrice to come home. I begged her. You have no proof of that, do you? Sterling snapped back. Just your word against hers. The word of the daughter who miraculously walked away with the entire estate. No further questions, Your Honor, Sterling said, walking back to his seat with a self-satisfied grin. David looked completely defeated. He rested his case. It was a Thursday afternoon. The sky outside the courtroom windows was slate gray, threatening a massive Chicago thunderstorm. It was time for closing arguments. The heavy, oppressive silence in the room felt like a physical weight on my chest. I stared at the wood grain on the table, resigning myself to my fate. Beatrice had done it. She had spun gold from lies. Judge Wallace leaned forward, adjusting his microphone. Mr. Sterling, you may proceed with your closing. He was cut off. The heavy, double oak doors at the back of the courtroom didn't just open. They were shoved open with such force that they hit the wall stops with a loud, resounding crack. Every head in the room whipped around. Judge Wallace slammed his gavel down, his face turning crimson with rage at the interruption. Order. What is the meaning of this? Bailiff, remove that man immediately. But the bailiff didn't move. He took one step toward the doors and froze. A man was standing in the doorway. He was tall, dressed in a sharp, impeccably tailored navy suit, holding a worn leather briefcase. He had salt and pepper hair and a face that looked like it was carved from granite. But it wasn't the man's appearance that made the courtroom hold its collective breath. It was the look on Judge Theodore Wallace's face, the color completely drained from the judge's cheeks. The gavel slipped from his hand, clattering loudly against the wood of his bench. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stared at the stranger as if he had just seen a ghost walk out of a grave. The man ignored the murmurs erupting in the gallery. He walked straight down the center aisle, his expensive leather shoes echoing against the marble floor. He didn't look at Beatrice. He didn't look at me. He looked directly at the judge. "Good afternoon, Teddy," the stranger said. His voice was deep, resonant, and echoed in the stunned silence of the courtroom. "I apologize for my tardiness. I had to pull a few old favors to get the right documents unsealed. But I believe I have some evidence regarding the Harrington estate that the court is going to find highly illuminating." Beatrice's lawyer, Richard Sterling, jumped to his feet. "Objection! Your Honor, who is this man? The evidentiary phase is closed. This is a mockery of the court." Judge Wallace finally found his voice, though it trembled in a way I had never heard from the legendary, iron-fisted judge. "Sit down, Mr. Sterling," Judge Wallace ordered, his eyes never leaving the stranger. He swallowed hard. "The court will hear from Mr. Montgomery." The courtroom was dead silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant rumble of thunder from the brewing Chicago storm outside. Every eye was fixed on the man who had just blown past the bailiff. He walked with the slow, measured confidence of a man who owned the room, despite never having set foot in it before today. "Sit down, Mr. Sterling," Judge Wallace repeated, his voice devoid of its usual booming authority. It was replaced by a strained, almost cautious tone. He swallowed hard, his eyes never leaving the stranger. "The court will hear from Mr. Montgomery." Harrison Montgomery was not a man you hired to draft a contract or settle a minor dispute. Even though I had never seen him before, the whispered panic erupting from my attorney, Arquette, told me everything I needed to know. Montgomery was a ghost in the legal world, a former federal prosecutor for the Southern District of New York, who had transitioned into high-stakes, black book corporate espionage and forensic accounting. When billionaires suspected their partners of embezzling, they didn't call the police. They called Montgomery, Hayes, and Croft. "Your Honor," Montgomery began, setting his worn leather briefcase on the podium right next to where a visibly sweating Richard Sterling was standing. "I apologize for circumventing standard procedural filings. However, the evidence I possess only legally unsealed at midnight last night, triggered by a specific contingency clause regarding this exact litigation." Sterling slammed his hand on the table. "This is outrageous. Civil procedure dictates discovery must be shared. We have no idea what this man is bringing into your courtroom, Judge." Judge Wallace leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped his gavel. "Mr. Sterling, if Harrison Montgomery is standing in my courtroom, he is not here to waste my time. I suggest you take your seat and listen, or I will hold you in contempt." "Proceed, Mr. Montgomery." Montgomery clicked open the brass locks of his briefcase. The sound was like the cocking of a shotgun in the quiet room. He pulled out 3 thick, bound folders and handed the first one to the bailiff to pass up to the judge. He handed the second to my bewildered attorney, and the third he slid across the table to Sterling. 10 months before his passing, my firm was secretly retained by the deceased, Montgomery stated, his voice carrying effortlessly to the back row of the gallery. He did not hire us to audit his legitimate real estate holdings. He hired us to investigate his eldest daughter, Beatrice Harrington Smythe, and her husband, Alistair Smythe. From the corner of my eye, I saw Beatrice flinch. It was a microscopic movement, a tiny twitch of her perfectly contoured jaw, but in the context of her usual icy composure, it was the equivalent of a scream. "Investigate her for what?" Judge Wallace asked, flipping through the first few pages of the heavy dossier. His eyes widened slightly as he scanned the first summary sheet. "For systemic, premeditated financial bleeding," Montgomery answered flatly. "The narrative presented in this courtroom over the past week has been that my client, the deceased, was mentally compromised, isolated, and manipulated by his youngest daughter into changing his will. The documents in front of you, Your Honor, prove the exact opposite. He changed his will because he discovered he was being robbed." "Objection! Defamation! Speculation!" Sterling roared, jumping up. "This is an ambush." "It is a forensic reality, Mr. Sterling," Montgomery countered without raising his voice, turning slightly to face the opposing table. "If you turn to tab 4 of the binder, you will see a detailed ledger of wire transfers. Over a period of 3 years, while the deceased was beginning his battle with ALS, Beatrice Harrington Smythe utilized power of attorney documents which we have verified were forged by a notary operating out of Geneva to siphon funds from her father's secondary offshore accounts." The jury box was completely transfixed. The older woman in the front row, who had been glaring at me suspiciously for days, was now staring at Beatrice with her jaw unhinged. "How much?" Judge Wallace asked, his voice low and dangerous. $8.4 million, Your Honor," Montgomery replied. A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. Even my own attorney dropped his pen. I sat frozen, staring at the back of Beatrice's head. $8 million? While she was telling me on the phone that she was too busy to come visit him? "This is a fabrication," Beatrice suddenly spoke up, her voice shrill, the refined British-American transatlantic accent completely vanishing. "He's lying. My father gave me that money. It was a gift." "A gift?" Montgomery raised an eyebrow, pulling a small audio transcript from his case. "A gift that was routed through 3 Delaware shell corporations, specifically Apex Holdings LLC and Vanguard Meridian, before finally landing in a numbered account at Standard Chartered in Zurich. People do not launder gifts, Mrs. Smythe." Sterling was rapidly flipping through the pages, his face draining of color. He was a shark, but even sharks know when there's blood in the water, and right now, the blood was his client's. "Why would she need to steal $8 million? Judge Wallace asked, pulling off his reading glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "The woman is married to a hedge fund manager in London. She has a trust." This was the question that had been burning in my mind. Beatrice had always flaunted her wealth. She wore custom Chanel to Thanksgiving dinner. She chartered helicopters just to avoid traffic. Why risk prison to steal from a dying man when she already had everything? Montgomery's expression turned remarkably grim. He looked at Beatrice, not with anger, but with the cold, clinical pity of a coroner examining a fatal mistake. "Because, Your Honor, Alistair Smythe's hedge fund, the Kensington Group, has been insolvent for 4 years, Montgomery revealed. Beatrice let out a sharp, strangled gasp. She slumped back in her chair as if she had been physically struck. The Kensington Group made a series of catastrophic, highly leveraged short bets on European energy markets, Montgomery explained to the court, breaking down the complex financial ruin into plain, devastating English. They were wiped out, completely, but instead of declaring bankruptcy, Alistair Smythe began utilizing new investor capital to pay off old investors to keep the illusion alive. A classic Ponzi structure. I felt the air leave my lungs. A Ponzi scheme. My sister, the golden child, was married to a massive fraud, and they were desperate. When the margin calls came in, they needed liquidity immediately, or they were going to face criminal prosecution by the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, Montgomery continued. So, Beatrice turned to the easiest source of capital she had, her father's dormant accounts. She assumed that because of his declining health, he would never notice. But my client was sharp until the very end. He noticed the discrepancies, and he hired me. Your Honor, I must ask for a recess, Sterling practically begged, his voice cracking. He was physically distancing himself from Beatrice at the defense table. He knew that if he continued to blindly defend a woman currently being exposed for international wire fraud and money laundering by a former federal prosecutor, his own license would be in jeopardy. Denied, Judge Wallace barked, his eyes flashing with righteous fury. You brought this circus into my courtroom, Mr. Sterling. You are going to sit there and watch the tent burn down. What else, Mr. Montgomery? You said the will was unsealed due to a contingency. Yes, Your Honor. Turn to tab 7. Montgomery waited a beat while the rustling of paper echoed through the room. When my client discovered the theft, he was heartbroken. But he was also a pragmatist. He knew that upon his death, Beatrice would come after the remaining estate. He knew she would claim he was mentally unfit. Montgomery turned to look directly at me for the first time. His eyes were surprisingly warm, a stark contrast to the cold executioner persona he had worn moments before. He knew she would try to destroy you to get the rest of the money to cover her husband's collapsing house of cards, Montgomery said to me quietly, before raising his voice back to the judge. So, we set a trap. A trap? Judge Wallace asked. My client specifically instructed me to allow Beatrice to file this lawsuit. He instructed his estate attorney to remain quiet, because we needed to see how far she would go to prove her false narrative. Montgomery pointed a stern finger at the witness stand where the night nurse had sat just yesterday. Tab 7 contains financial records proving that Beatrice Harrington Smythe wired $50,000 to the primary medical expert who testified against my client's mental state. Furthermore, it contains a paper trail of a $15,000 consulting fee paid to the night nurse who committed perjury in this very courtroom 48 hours ago. The courtroom erupted. The gallery exploded into shouts and gasps. The bailiff stepped forward, his hand resting instinctively on his utility belt. My attorney, Arquette, let out a loud, involuntary laugh of pure shock. Beatrice sprang from her chair. It's a setup. Chloe orchestrated this. She faked these documents, she screamed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at me. Her hair, usually perfectly sprayed into place, was flying wildly around her face. She looked unhinged. She looked terrifying. Crack, crack, crack. Judge Wallace slammed his gavel with enough force to dent the wood. Silence! He roared. The sheer volume of his voice commanded absolute stillness. He glared down at Beatrice with a look of absolute disgust. Mrs. Smythe, you are currently standing in the center of a crater of your own making. If you speak one more word out of turn, I will have you remanded to county lockup for contempt before you can blink. Beatrice slowly sank back into her chair, burying her face in her hands. A single, choked sob echoed in the quiet room. Judge Wallace turned his attention to Beatrice's attorney. Mr. Sterling, I suggest you advise your client of her Fifth Amendment rights immediately, because as of this moment, I am dismissing this civil suit with extreme prejudice. The judge then looked at the court reporter, his tone turning deadly serious. Furthermore, I am ordering a full transcript of these proceedings, along with Mr. Montgomery's evidence binders, to be sent directly to the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, with my personal recommendation to open an immediate criminal grand jury investigation into Beatrice Harrington Smythe for perjury, witness tampering, and wire fraud. It was over. In the span of 20 minutes, the entire narrative had violently flipped. The ghost of my father had walked into the room through Harrison Montgomery and protected me one last time. He hadn't just left me his fortune, he had left me an impenetrable shield. The sound of Judge Theodore Wallace's gavel striking the wooden block echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous room, but the silence that followed was even more deafening. The invincible facade of the Harrington Smythe empire had just been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The immediate aftermath in the courtroom was a blur of frantic, desperate motion. Richard Sterling, the high-priced legal assassin who had spent the last week dragging my name through the mud, didn't even look at my sister. He was a man accustomed to winning, and more importantly, a man accustomed to operating strictly within the bounds of legal ethics, no matter how aggressively he stretched them. Being unknowingly tethered to international wire fraud and perjury was a career death sentence. Sterling snapped his Italian leather briefcase shut with aggressive finality. "I am formally withdrawing as your counsel, Mrs. Smythe," he said, his voice cold and devoid of any prior warmth. "Do not contact my office. Any further communication will be handled through my malpractice insurers." Beatrice reached out, her fingers trembling as she grabbed the sleeve of his expensive suit. "Richard, you can't leave me here. You work for me. I pay you." "You pay me with stolen funds," Sterling hissed, yanking his arm away. "You are on your own." He turned on his heel and marched out of the double doors, leaving Beatrice completely isolated at the heavy mahogany defense table. My attorney, Arquette, let out a long, shuddering breath and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Harrison Montgomery, the man who had just dismantled a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme with 3 binders of paper, simply closed his briefcase, the brass lock snapping shut with a satisfying click. "Mr. Montgomery," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Thank you. I didn't know. I didn't know any of this." Montgomery offered a small, solemn nod. "Your father was a complicated man, but he was not a fool. He knew exactly what he was leaving behind, and exactly who he needed to protect. You were the only genuine thing in his life." Before I could process the weight of those words, the courtroom doors opened again. This time, it wasn't a surprise witness. It was 2 plainclothes federal agents from the United States Attorney's Office, flanked by 2 uniformed court officers. Judge Wallace had made good on his promise with terrifying speed. They bypassed the gallery and walked directly to the defense table. "Beatrice Harrington Smythe?" the taller agent asked, flashing a gold badge. "Special Agent Reynolds, FBI White Collar Division. We have a warrant for your arrest regarding charges of wire fraud, interstate commerce violations, and suspected money laundering. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." For a moment, I thought Beatrice was going to faint. The color completely washed out of her face, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. The transatlantic accent, the haughty posture, the aura of invincibility, it all melted away, leaving a terrified, desperate woman in a wrinkled designer suit. "No, wait," she stammered, backing away from the table. "There's a mistake. My husband Alistair, he handles the finances. I didn't know the extent of it. I was just following his instructions." "You can explain that to the magistrate judge," Agent Reynolds said, his voice completely devoid of sympathy. He reached out, firmly grasping her arm, and spun her around. The sound of steel handcuffs ratcheting closed around my sister's wrists is a sound that will be burned into my memory for the rest of my life. It was the sharp, metallic sound of hard karma, finally catching up to a lifetime of entitlement. As they led her down the center aisle, her eyes met mine. There was no hatred left in them, only raw, unadulterated terror. She looked at me, the sister she had mocked, abandoned, and tried to destroy, and silently pleaded for help. But there was nothing I could do. The bridge hadn't just been burned, she had dynamited it. I watched without a word as the heavy oak doors closed behind her. The fallout from that afternoon in Chicago sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. Harrison Montgomery's forensic evidence wasn't just handed over to the U.S. Attorney. It was shared with Interpol and the Financial Conduct Authority in London. By the time Beatrice was sitting in a holding cell in Cook County, a coordinated raid was taking place at the Kensington Group's lavish offices in Mayfair. Alistair Smythe was arrested on the tarmac at Heathrow Airport, clutching a one-way first-class ticket to Dubai. His Ponzi scheme had completely collapsed under the weight of the investigation. He had defrauded investors of nearly £200 million, and he had used my dying father's stolen money to try and plug the holes in his sinking ship. The international press had a field day. The tabloids ran front-page spreads detailing the Harrington Smythe House of Lies. They exposed the fake charities, the leased yachts they pretended to own, and the sheer, staggering arrogance of their financial crimes. My sister, who had spent her entire life carefully curating an image of flawless, untouchable wealth, was now the poster child for upper-class greed. For the first few weeks, I felt like I was drowning in the aftermath. The estate was frozen temporarily, while the federal authorities untangled the stolen $8 million from Beatrice's remaining accounts. I spent my days in endless meetings with federal prosecutors, turning over every scrap of paper my father had ever signed, cooperating fully to ensure the estate was clean. During that time, I retreated to the one place that made sense, the youth shelter in the city. The noise, the chaos, the genuine need of the kids there grounded me. It reminded me that the world of offshore accounts and hedge funds was a fiction, while the struggle for a warm bed and a decent meal was reality. 6 months later, the dust finally began to settle. Alistair Smythe, facing an insurmountable mountain of forensic evidence, took a plea deal in the UK. He was sentenced to 14 years in Belmarsh prison, stripped of his assets, and permanently banned from trading. Beatrice's trial was a public spectacle in Chicago. Without Alistair's stolen money to fund a high-powered defense team, she was assigned a public defender. The prosecution didn't even need me to testify. They had the forged power of attorney documents, the wire transfer receipts, and the paper trail connecting her directly to the bribed witnesses in our civil trial. When the verdict was read, I sat in the back row of the gallery. I wore a simple black dress, blending into the shadows. Beatrice stood before a federal judge, not Judge Wallace, but a stern woman who looked equally unforgiving. Beatrice Harrington Smythe, the judge announced, looking down at her over her glasses. Your actions demonstrate a profound and calculating lack of moral compass. You exploited your vulnerable, dying father, subverted the justice system through bribery, and actively attempted to ruin your sister's life out of sheer greed. The court sentences you to 96 months in federal prison, without the possibility of early parole. 8 years. Beatrice slumped, her face burying into her hands. There were no cameras allowed in federal court, but the sketch artist captured the exact moment her spirit broke. She was transported to a minimum security facility in Danbury, Connecticut. The woman who once complained that the thread count at the Four Seasons in Milan was too low was now sleeping on a steel cot, wearing a state-issued khaki uniform. With the criminal proceedings concluded, my father's estate was finally released from probate. The $42 million, the commercial real estate, the liquid assets, it was all legally mine. I didn't buy a yacht. I didn't move to London. I didn't even buy a new car. Instead, I called Harrison Montgomery. We met at his private office downtown, overlooking the Chicago River. The funds have cleared, and the estate is officially settled, Montgomery said, handing me a thick manila envelope. The remaining stolen funds were recovered from Alistair's frozen accounts and returned to the principal balance. You are now a very wealthy woman. What are your instructions regarding the commercial properties? I looked at the documents, feeling the immense weight of the legacy. Sell them, I said firmly. All the commercial downtown properties. Liquidate them and add them to the trust. Montgomery raised a salt and pepper eyebrow. That's a significant taxable event. May I ask why? Because I'm not a real estate tycoon, I replied, a small smile touching my lips. I'm a social worker. Over the next 2 years, I used the Harrington fortune to fundamentally change the landscape of youth services in Chicago. I purchased a massive, abandoned corporate campus on the South Side and converted it into the Harrington Legacy Foundation. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a comprehensive support system. We built state-of-the-art dormitories, an on-site medical clinic, a vocational training center, and a full-scale culinary arts program. I hired the best counselors, the best teachers, and paid them double the state average. The night we cut the ribbon on the new facility, the mayor was there, along with local news anchors and hundreds of the kids we had helped over the years. As I stood on the podium, looking out at the crowd, I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. I had taken a fortune built on cutthroat business tactics and transformed it into a machine that generated hope. After the ceremony, as the crowds thinned out and the catering staff began to clean up, Harrison Montgomery approached me in the empty courtyard. He was wearing his usual impeccable navy suit, holding a small, sealed envelope. I have one final piece of business to conclude, he said, holding the envelope out to me. Your father instructed me to hold this until the estate was settled and you had chosen your path. He said you would know what to do with the money, but he wanted to make sure you understood why he did what he did. My hands shook slightly as I took the envelope. It was sealed with heavy wax, bearing my father's old signet ring impression. I broke the seal and pulled out a single piece of heavy, cream-colored stationery. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written in the final, difficult weeks of his life, but the words were sharp and clear. My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, Then the storm has passed. I am so deeply sorry for the battle I forced you to fight. I knew Beatrice was stealing from me. I knew her soul had been corrupted by the world I introduced her to. I could have stopped her quietly, but I knew that when I died, she would turn her sights on you. She would have crushed you to protect her illusions. I couldn't protect you from the disease that took my body, but I could protect you from her. I built the trap so she would expose herself on the public stage, leaving you completely untouchable. It was the only way to guarantee your safety. I spent my life building an empire of concrete and glass, but in the quiet dark of my final days, I realized my only true legacy was sitting beside my bed, holding my hand. You have a heart of gold in a world obsessed with brass. Use everything I left you to shine your light. I am so incredibly proud of you. With all my love, Dad. Tears blurred my vision as I folded the letter, holding it tightly against my chest. The cool evening breeze swept through the courtyard of the new foundation, rustling the leaves of the freshly planted oak trees. The money hadn't changed me. It had simply amplified who I already was, just as it had amplified who my sister had chosen to become. I looked up at the stars, twinkling above the Chicago skyline, finally able to breathe. The ghost was gone, the golden child had fallen, and the quiet daughter was finally, truly, standing in the light. They say money changes people, but I learned it merely unmasks them. My sister traded her freedom for the illusion of wealth, while my father used his final breath to protect the daughter who simply stayed. True inheritance isn't found in offshore accounts or luxury estates. It's the peace of sleeping with a clear conscience, knowing that when the gavel finally falls, you are standing on the side of truth.